From the beginning of this journal entry, I want to acknowledge that I'm going to be interpreting a player's tone of voice from an anecdote I'm going to share, and I could be very wrong. I'm not always great at reading social cues or intentions, so this may be me seeing what I want to see to match an idea I already possess. So, yeah, let's get into it. In one of my recent D&D games, the player characters descended into a mine to rescue an automaton worker. The characters knew that the automatons had collapsed their particular mineshaft to protect the other workers from some monstrous threat. Talking to the foreman, reports from before the collapse had workers saying that they were hearing some form of clicking and slopping sounds. Now, most of the players in this group are fairly experienced in the hobby, and they were already making assumptions of what kinds of creatures they were about to fight. Continuing down the tunnel, an animal's perception check in the party picked up an oxidized type smell in the air. The word rust was quickly said, and followed up by the full term of rust monster. Players started sharing their claims of having suspected it from the beginning, as well as one person's personal anecdote of a rust monster being the very first monster that they had ever fought in D&D when they started back in the 70s. Everyone started having faltering conversations about what to do. Despite the table knowledge, the paladin of the group played into the idea of, nah, whatever's going on, it won't be that bad, before taking the lead in the party to continue on down the tunnel once more. They even used their prosthetic arm as a means of trying to coax out the creatures in a kind of a here doggy doggy type manner. By the time that the clicking insect-like creatures started to show in the gloom, everyone had the technical confirmations to what the table really already knew. And with that, initiative was rolled. The paladin up front, playing into the narrative, ended up at the top of the initiative order. Striding forward to better see the creatures in the gloom, they immediately cast a magic weapon on their warhammer to make it immune to the rust monster's attacks. Their turn swiftly ended with a, "I'm sorry, that's metagaming, but yeah, that's what I'm doing." I might have the exact phrase wrong, but that was the idea. The words were said in a pointed tone that acted as a challenge. They may have started with an apologetic phrase, but it wasn't an apology. It was a social buffer before the challenge of, unless you, me, as the game master, want to make a big deal about this, I'm doing it. And before anyone else could speak, I was defending them. I was defending their self-labeled metagaming. The possible aggression in their voice was not directed at me or the table in general. It was a release of frustration and a warding attack before any opposition could tell them that they were wrong to be frustrated. The term metagaming gets used for a lot of different things. In this case, it was about using player knowledge of the mechanics and monster stats of the game for character gain. Specifically, it was knowing that if they attacked the rust monster with their hammer would be damaged and eventually destroyed. The frustration was increased because this paladin has already used the magic weapon spell many times, and they knew that it could protect their equipment, and to not do so now would just be shooting themselves in the foot. And I immediately defended their actions because I recognized that frustration. When you play a game long enough, you know how things work. Being forced to pretend like you don't and having to do that self-hampering is incredibly frustrating. Because of that, I run my games with an expectation that you can use any accumulated player knowledge that you have with the idea that if you feel like your character wouldn't know something, well, that's on you to not use it. Deliberately looking up creature stats in preparation or in the middle of combat is downright cheating, but you shouldn't be punished for being a longtime player, or even more so, a game master yourself, and just knowing things. On the opposite side of this, I maintain the right to change monsters however I want in preparation for an encounter, if I want to preserve the mysteries of that monster. In this case, the party did learn that the creatures were resistant to bludgeoning damage, and the bigger ones corroded metal more efficiently. Those are changes that I made to at least have a small twist on the combat, but yeah, They're rust monsters. They're gonna rust things. Despite being open about my expectations of player knowledge use, the paladins still had that intense initial defense of their actions. Whether it was forgetting how I run the game compared to other game masters, or just feeling the phantom ridicule of a community, they felt like they were expected to be stupid. They were expected to feign ignorance when they knew better, to an extent to let themselves be hazed despite having seniority at the table. Now, I don't like hazing at all, but that's another topic, another time. Some people may consider feigning ignorance of a game's deepest tropes to be an act of suspending disbelief to get the experience of it all again from a new character's eyes. If you are a player capable of that, I envy you. I don't believe most players are capable of that level of suspending disbelief. Rather, in cases like this, I think it's more akin to watching a murder mystery movie. You can only go into one of those movies once not knowing who did it. That is, unless you were around for the initial theatrical releases of Clue, but that's another story. Once you see a murder mystery movie or read a movie mystery book, rewatches, rereads are a different experience. On the second time through, you don't have to follow the narrative and try to read through all the different motives. You know the answer, and you're now looking to see the clues and other tells in real time. If you know who the murderer is before watching, your first viewing acts as a second viewing. You just never get that first viewing experience. Despite getting to jump ahead, you can't jump back. With that, you should respect people who haven't seen the movie or had the ending spoiled yet, but aside from that respect, you shouldn't be shamed for having already seen it. That's how I view this sort of metagame knowledge of monster abilities or weaknesses. Unless I, as the game master, choose to change the monsters, I can't expect a player to treat this encounter as their first if it isn't. With that, I choose to embrace knowledge of the tropes. The kicker of it is that I planned this encounter as a story beat knowing that pretty much everyone would know what was going on. I knew the paladin had magic weapon, that the druid had shillelagh, and all of that. I wanted it to be an encounter for the heroes to go into it feeling clever. Despite that, there was this sense of wrongfulness brought in from the outside that was never intended. Now, the source of that negative feeling is a much deeper subject that I can get into. There are layers of tribalism, of generational / additional views of how the game is supposed to be played, and a bunch of stuff like that. My thoughts on this particular interaction would probably be different if the defensiveness was about something I don't like to happen at my table, rather than something I have a healthy relationship with. All of that is also wrapped up with my initial disclaimer that I might be interpreting the interaction as more poignant to fit an idea that I already have thoughts on. Whether the truth of this specific example actually matches my point, I feel like that the point is still valid with something that a lot of tables struggle with. It could be how much player knowledge is acceptable, how it is implemented, or how the players are expected to restrain themselves. But knowledge is a one-way line. Once you know something, rarely can you step back across that line again. It affects how you think and what you expect out of yourself. This is true for both sides of the line. There is no shame on being on one side of the line or the other. The pain occurs when you are unjustly expected to be where you aren't. And this is my SendingKenku. Don't blame yourself for temporary ignorance or arduous enlightenment. Recognize where you are on your journey and respect others for where they are on theirs.